These are the most common trimming tools we use in the studio. These are called loop tools, and they come with different size and different thickness. These small tools are fine for almost everything you make in the studio, so I would recommend you grab one of these. I'll also show you how to use this kind of tool, which is basically just a bent piece of metal that's sharpened. These are much easier to resharpen, and we do sharpen the tools when they get dull, because sharp tools cut the clay much easier than dull tools, and it affects the way the trimming goes. So I'll just use this one first. This bowl is ready for trimming. The most important part is the center of the foot, where the foot's going to be, and I can tell how stiff the clay is just by smushing it with my finger a little bit. If the rim of the pot has started to change color, it's too hard to trim, and you should just start over. This seems good, and I'm going to feel how thick the clay is here, try and remember what I felt when I made it, and then put it on the wheel head and trim. I'll show you how to trim on the wheel head first, but most of the time I actually trim on a chuck. So this will be a good starting point, but there are other ways to secure the bowl to the wheel. The first thing you have to do is recenter the bowl on the wheel head. And I'm going to center the clay here where the foot will blend in with the bowl. You can safely ignore the rim in where you picked it up off the wheel head usually. So if I drag with my fingernail or with a tool and make a line on the pot, I can push the clay, push away from where it was towards me. You notice when I push the clay, I put my hands right on the wheel head. That's so I know how far I'm pushing the clay. So it's almost centered. This is close enough. You don't have to do anything perfectly. And that's centered. So the next suggestion to keep it centered is to use 4 chunks of clay to hold the piece down on the wheel head. And I tend to use pretty big pieces of clay and think of them almost like a hot dog to hold the clay down. What you want to do is bend the clay a little bit so it matches the shape of your bowl and press straight down into the wheel head. If you press this way, you'll make the bowl into an oval. So that's one side, and here's the other. By pressing down on both sides at the same time, I'm less likely to shove the clay one way or another while holding it down. So we'll turn it back on and check. That's still centered. When you go to trim, you're going to do things the same way every time. You're first going to make the bottom flat, then trim the outside, then hollow out the inside of the foot ring. The reason why you want to make this flat first is if the foot is higher on one side than the other, it'll be thicker and thinner as well. The easiest way to make it flat is to use the small end of the tool to cut the clay away. And what I'm going to do is use the flat part of the tool to jig where the tool is cutting. So this may make no sense, but I have the tool on the opposite side of the wheel. It's only going to cut from the center towards 3 o'clock. But what I do is I very lightly press down on this side harder than this side and move the tool towards the outside edge. And what happens is the pot is not uneven in the center. If it's angled, it's going to still stay still in the center. And what's happening now is this part of the tool is riding on the surface that the leading edge cut. I bumped off the piece of clay that was holding my bowl down. So put it back on. So I'll cut towards 3 o'clock and make the bottom flat. This was pretty flat to begin with, but now it's very flat. The next thing you want to do is trim the outside, and you can finish the design of your bowl any way you like. I recommend when you're starting that oftentimes the fingerprints that when you picked up the bowl will cause the tool to bounce around. So the easiest thing to do is cut your fingerprints off by starting on a surface which is smooth and pressing down into the fingerprints. If you put the tool on the outside, it will tend to follow along the bumps that are there. So I'll hold on to the tool and press straight down and cut off the bumps. I'm going to stop the wheel and show you that this is the correct stiffness for the clay. If it comes off in little small chunks, the clay is probably too hard. If it sticks to the tool, it's probably still too soft to trim. You want to trim at the same speed that you throw. If you trim with the wheel going very slowly, it takes so long for the wheel to go around that it'll probably be uneven. You won't be able to hold the tool still. And if you trim with the thing going very fast, well, if anything bad happens, it happens really quickly. So I recommend you trim about the same speed you throw. One other thing to notice is that I almost always touch the pot at the same time as I trim, and that kind of references where the tool is, so I can steer where I'm cutting. I also hold onto the tool very lightly with two hands, and I'm oftentimes grabbing onto the tool right opposite where it's cutting. If you're holding on here or steadying the tool here, it'll cut much more smoothly than if you try and muscle the clay and hold on without referencing the edge. So I hold onto the tool lightly with my fingertips, and I also apply pressure in two directions. So I'm oftentimes pushing this way and pulling this way very lightly, and that holds the tool much more steady than grabbing onto it very tightly. You can use any part of this tool to cut the clay. That's why this shaped loop tool is so handy to use. I should mention one other thing about cutting the clay. If I have it at this angle, obviously the cutting edge isn't even touching the clay, so it won't cut. And if I have it at this angle, the clay has to turn 90 degrees, so I'm basically scraping when I cut this way. If you hold the tool so that bevel angle is cutting, it cuts with the least amount of drag, so that's oftentimes preferable. I'm going to trim the outside of this piece, and you'll see that I use different parts of the tool in order to make the shape that I want. I don't have to trim very far down the bowl. You can trim all the way to the rim if you want to, but this is thin enough that I don't need to trim more than 1/4 of the way or 1/3 of the way down. When I'm trimming the foot, I'm thinking about how to best finish the form that I began when I threw, and the rim has a curve, so I'm going to make a curve where the foot transitions into the bowl here as well. This edge you don't want to have sharp. It can chip more easily if it's sharp, and it can scratch your table. So I almost always make a small chamfer on the outside edge. And if you smooth it with your finger, it's a good idea as well. The outside's done. Now I'm going to hollow the inside. And again, you can see that I'm holding on the tool right opposite where it's cutting. The best way to do this is probably to use the small part of the tool because it cuts with the least drag. I also reference where the tool is cutting by using my ring finger, so I pull the tool toward my finger. It's much more easy to do than to try and cut from the center towards the outside without having any reference where the foot is. Start in the middle and pull towards the foot, towards the outside of the foot. Oftentimes what I do is I'll cut towards the foot and then stop and then make another cut. This side of the tool can accidentally bump the inside of the foot ring as you're pulling toward if you're looking down here. So I pick up the handle of the tool so that this doesn't hit the inside of the foot ring. This thickness usually has something to do with the thickness of the rim. It's probably good not to make it too thin and wiry. So I'll make a final pass here and determine the thickness that I want. Now round off the inside edge just a little bit as well, and then use my finger to smooth things out. You'll know it's correct if you pick it up and it feels right. This curve more or less transfers right through the foot ring and is a curve on the bottom of the pot as well. I think that's good. I'm going to describe tapping the bowl on center. So rather than measuring, I'm going to bump the bowl until it's in the middle of the wheel. And I'm right-handed, so I use my left hand to do this. I think it works easier if I don't use my dominant hand. And I'm actually looking over here and hitting over here. You want to bump the bowl where it's thick. If you hit it on the rim down here, you'll probably warp something. So I'm going to tap the bowl on center by bumping the pot up here where the clay is the thickest. And if I look over here and don't think about what I'm doing, it's quite easy to put the bowl on center quicker than stopping and making marks and measuring. So I'll do that again. And I can change the wheel speed as well. If I have a hard time putting something on center, I need to go faster or slower. That's one way to make tapping on center easier. I oftentimes don't wait for the wheel to turn all the way around before I tap again, and I don't really know how my brain figures out when to hit the clay, but I've done it so many times that it seems that it automatically happens. You can kind of hear the rim sliding. Each piece that you put on the wheel is going to have a different coefficient of friction down here, and if it's very soft, you definitely don't want to tap it on center because you'll probably warp something. I'll do that one more time. Put it off center and then put it back on again. Even if this takes you half a minute to do, it's faster than stopping the wheel. So that's the easiest way to center something. Now I'll just trim it. I don't hurry when I trim, but I don't fool around either. The best thing to do is just cut the clay. You've probably got other bowls that you need to trim anyway. So do it and get on to the next one. The gesture that you leave behind when you trim is just as important as the gesture you made when you threw. So oftentimes they need to be considered and maybe complement each other. Even though it's a little crooked, it's smooth. Feels good.